In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so one of the things I want to say, and we are starting early tonight, but one of the things I wanted to say tonight was, in my kind of view of things, the topics we're doing tonight and next week are really at the center of what we are about as Catholics and as Christians, right? So, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ? And what do we believe about the person of Jesus? I think those two questions are two of the most important questions that any one of us can ever ask or answer. So I think we're kind of at the heart of things this evening. And a little bit about the figure of Jesus himself. So there was a masterful work done, written in 1991 by a priest by the name of John Meyer, Meier, a marginal Jew rethinking the historical Jesus. And this is volume 1. I'm going to be passing this book around so you all can take a look at it. But what he asked, the question that he asked was, let's say we had no faith at all, and you had 4 good historians that were willing to look at the figure of Jesus in history. So let's say you had a Catholic scholar who was a historian, a Jewish scholar that was a historian, a Protestant, and an atheist. Lock the 4 of them, and I think he said the Harvard Law School library, and make them use the best current historical methods that we have to ask the question, what do we know about Jesus purely from an historical point of view? Not even asking yet about the question of faith. And so, volume 1 is the beginning of that question for John Meyer. He says, okay, what do we know about Jesus quite apart from faith? And I think, by the way, this is not an unimportant question. And I think it's not unimportant because, unlike other major religious traditions in the world, we do not believe Jesus is only a figure of speech. We do not believe that he's a fictional character or a parable or a symbol, but we believe that Jesus was an historical figure who lived at a very particular time and place in human history. And there are documents that attest to that, even outside of the Christian faith. And so, what Meyer did was he said, what can we know about him? He asked, in volume 1, he asked the basic questions. What kind of education would he have had? What would his upbringing been like as a Jewish person in the first century? What would his languages have been, language or languages? What was the trade of carpentry? He was called the son of a carpenter, that sort of thing. So you learn a load of information about the context of Jesus. And when I read the volume years ago, it was published in 91, my answer to what do we know just from the historical point of view about Jesus, the answer is actually quite a lot. So I think it's worth exploring that. I will also add, Pope Benedict, when he was Pope, wrote 3 books about Jesus of Nazareth. He wrote a first volume kind of introducing Jesus, 1 volume on the passion and death of Jesus, and 1 volume on the birth stories, the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke. And in a little footnote in volume 1, Pope Benedict said of John Meyer's works, in a little footnote, he said, clearly Benedict had read, this is volume 1 of about 5 volumes that John Meyer did before he died. He never got to the Passion, so I'm sad about he didn't finish the great project. Maybe somebody will take it up, you know. But Pope Benedict wrote about the work that he was doing, and he noted that it showed both the value of and the limits of a purely historical study of Jesus. And I think that that's a great insight, fantastic insight into good history, quite apart from faith, but it also shows you the limits of what we can know through history alone. But it's worth noting that, uh, to the best of our historical knowledge, Jesus was born around 4 to 6 BC. That may strike you as odd that he was born before Christ, but when they created the calendar, they were just a bit off a few years. Best historical understanding today. Roughly lived to be, the traditional age is 33 years old, so somewhere around the year 30 AD, was crucified under the governorship of Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman official in that area, would have been responsible for keeping order during a big Jewish festival called Passover in the temple area, and and it's interesting, in the creed that we say every Sunday, besides Jesus, there are only two historical figures that are mentioned. Anybody know what those historical figures are? Well, one is Pontius Pilate for sure. So, and again, an acknowledged historical figure, and Mary, I think, right, is married, as also mentioned. So, um, so the son of a carpenter, known as the son of a carpenter. The word carpenter in the ancient world was, I think the Greek is teknon, and it refers to somebody who built things out of both wood and stone. So a laboring person, so that would have been in the first century of the Roman Empire, kind of a lower middle class job, sort of like construction workers would be today. And in the village of Nazareth, which is in Galilee. So if you go to Nazareth today, it's a big city, but they still have marked these important, significant places that we'll be referring to some degree. Nearby, not far away, within a walking distance, was a big Greek city, Greek speaking, primarily Hellenistic, called Sepphoris. Some scholars think that Joseph might have done work there. Others would say probably not. He probably didn't go into the Greek city. The common language of the day, most citizens would have spoken Greek. It was the language of the eastern part of the empire. The government officials would have known Latin, and and then the ordinary Jewish people spoke Semitic languages. So Aramaic would have been the mother tongue of Jesus. And of course, Mary was Jewish. Joseph, her husband, was Jewish. And the first followers of Jesus were Jewish. Interestingly, born, according to Matthew and Luke, in Bethlehem, which is a little south of Jerusalem. So we're talking about less than a week's walk from Nazareth. And most of his public ministry, which only took about 1 to 3 years, took place in Galilee, right along the northeastern edge of the Sea of Galilee. So, a relatively small geographical area. He was never um, a government official of any kind. He never wrote any books. He was never a great warrior. He left behind no works of art. All of the things that make figures well known in ancient world history. And yet, there have been more books written about Jesus of Nazareth than any other figure in human history. So the impact of this life on the world has been unbelievably profound. You could say that even from a purely historical point of view, you could argue that no other human figure in human history has impacted the course of human history as much as this one individual. So, that in itself is remarkable, I would say. So, tonight we're going to be looking at some of those kind of fundamental historical things. We've already done that. But at the same time, we are going to be approaching this question of who Jesus is from the point of view of faith. And I will add that for us who follow him, there's no other way to look at Jesus than through the lenses of our faith, right? We've been given a 2,000-year tradition of believers in Jesus Christ, and that faith has been handed on those 2,000 years, and we're the grateful recipients of that tradition. I will add, though, um, sometimes it is helpful to bracket everything that we know about Jesus already and see him again with fresh new eyes. Why do I think that's helpful? Well, there was a little volume, a little book called Once More Astonished, written by a Jesuit scripture scholar, Jan Lambrecht, about the parables of Jesus. And he said the problem with the parables of Jesus for us today is that we hear the beginning of a story and we go, what do we say? A man was going from Jerusalem down to Jericho and he got beaten up by some robbers. We know the whole story, don't we? So our brain kind of turns off, right? Oh, yeah, I've heard that before. But what Professor Lombrecht pointed out was that when Jesus originally told parables, most of the parables that he told were very engaging narratives that drew people in, and something very unexpected would happen in the course of the parable and turn the listener's world sort of upside down. So they were shocking and surprising when first told. And he said, we have to go back and rediscover that great astonishment that people had when they first heard Jesus proclaim a parable. I would add, it is helpful for us as Christians to become once more astonished by the person of Jesus. You know, we have fit him into our cultural boxes and we think we know everything we need to know about him. And yet there is something very surprising about the person of Jesus that I want to have us look at tonight. Now, how do we know anything at all about Jesus? Even John Meyer will say, what are the best sources of information that we have to know about the Jesus of history? And he will answer Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the four Gospels are our four greatest sources of both historical information about Jesus, but they're also faith portraits. So those who wrote the Gospels were not trying to write history as historians do today in a so-called fair and objective way. What they were doing was they were saying, we have found life in this person and we want everybody to know all about it. So they're all written from a faith conviction point of view. So nothing historical is told about Jesus apart from that conviction of faith that was handed down to these evangelists in the early church. Now, there is a bit of an historical layering to the current four Gospels that we have. I want to talk about that briefly. They didn't drop out of heaven. No angel whispered in the ears, write this, but we believe that they were written with an historical process, just like all of the Old Testament has an historical background to it. So uh, if the resurrection of Jesus happened around 30 AD, the scholars who've spent some time delving into the historicity of the Gospels believe that it took about 40 years until the first written gospel was written. And the consensus of modern historical critical scholars, probably the Gospel of Mark. Traditionally, Matthew was believed to have been the first written. So I'll talk a little bit, not in depth, but a little bit about why many modern historical scholars believe Mark was the first. And I think the evidence supports that very strongly. But that Jesus of history lived and breathed, taught, and was crucified and died, and we Christians believe rose from the dead around 30 AD. So between that window of time and the writing of the Gospels, what was going on in that early Christian community? What were they about?
Would have to be mostly oral tradition between each other.
Yes, oral tradition. Uh, Come and meet someone who told me everything about my life. That's what the Samaritan woman at the well said, right? I got to tell you about this. I think I may have met the Messiah, she told her villagers in Samaria. So after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the first Christians, the apostles, went everywhere. What did they do? They announced the good news. What was the heart of the good news? I got something great I got to tell you. Everybody's got to know it. This Jesus that was crucified by the Romans has been raised from the dead by the Father. He's alive again. And because of that, all of our lives are made new. Our sins are forgiven. We have a brand new beginning. Uh, Death itself is conquered. It's not the final word now. So we got to tell everybody this. Believe this good news. So the very word gospel, euangelion in Greek, glad tidings or good news, was normally associated with a victory in battle. I got some great news. We finally beat those Philistines, you know? So that was uh, the proclamation over about a 40-year window of time. Eventually, they did begin to write down the Gospels. Why do you think there was a bit of a delay before you started getting a written gospel?
People had different translations of what they actually saw and then back and forth. And then I guess
So different experiences. Remember, and memory is a very interesting thing as a human being, isn't it? When I was a child, probably, I don't know, I'm guessing 7 years old, myself and my two brothers were with my grandmother on the square in Lawrenceburg, and we began to fight. And so we were chasing each other around my grandmother's car. And my grandmother was getting increasingly angry. She was Italian. She was yelling at us to stop, and we wouldn't stop. And so when we finally got in the car, she was so angry. She said, I'm going to take you to the convent, and you're going to tell sister what you did. And we're just begging Grandma, please don't make us go to the convent. Please don't make us go to the convent. I can remember it like it was yesterday. I mean, it's crystal clear in my brain, right? So we drive to the convent. We have to ring the doorbell. God was watching out for us. Sister was not at the convent that day. Nobody answered the door. So here's the funny thing. Why do I remember that experience as a kid? Why is it still so vivid in my brain? I was scared and trouble. It had a profound emotional impact, right? So I will not forget the story. And what happened was, until this very day, when we have family gatherings and my brothers in our gathering will say, remember when we were chasing each other around Grandma's car at the square? We tell the story orally over and over again. So we've been telling that story since I was a kid. And about 5 years ago, while we're telling the story around the dinner table, my mom speaks up for the first time. And she just said this comment. She said, we never let y'all stay alone with Grandma after that because she couldn't handle you all. Well, I didn't know that. That was new information for me. So my mother was another source of information about that childhood story that the rest of us as kids, we didn't pick up on. I'm sure if my grandmother were still here in the world, she could probably tell her own side of the story. Um, but so when you read the Gospels, by the way, most of the Gospel stories, especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three synoptics, I want to describe them as sort of like a rosary or a bead of pearls, in the sense that you start a story in the Gospels, it has a beginning and a conclusion, and then it goes on to another story and another story. They're like beads of a rosary. They're self-contained narratives. And in a sense, you could move those beads around quite a lot and not notice any difference, actually. They don't really often have a huge amount of interconnections. So someone had to collect these narratives together. And so I will add, for example, if if you've been a man who's been blind since you were born and you get healed from your blindness, are you going to tell everybody you meet about that experience? And are you later going to follow Jesus? Probably so. And this blind man is eventually going to tell the writer, this is what happened to me. And so these oral stories eventually are going to get written down. There was, if you read the New Testament, there was this sense that Jesus was going to return very quickly, very quickly. So they had to get the word out quickly. They weren't yet thinking about writing these things down for a long period of time because they needed to tell everybody about them. Uh, Anybody know when Peter and Paul were martyred? When were they put to death in the city of Rome?
at the year 60.
Circa 60 something, let's say 64, something like that. Both Peter and Paul, great apostles of Jesus, spreading the good news, had gone to the city of Rome. There was a fire in the city of Rome. The Emperor Nero was the emperor at the time, and people were very angry, and that anger goes out to political figures when things don't go well. So what did Nero do? Like many good political figures, he blamed somebody. He blamed the Christians. It's their fault that there was a fire. And as a result of that, you have the first Christians put to death in the city of Rome. And both Peter and Paul were both put to death. That fact itself, the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, preeminent witnesses to the gospel, probably led to the writing of the first gospel. Why? Because those first witnesses, now that we thought the risen Lord was going to come back soon, have died. And before all of these witnesses disappear, this needs to be put in writing. In fact, the Gospel of Mark uh, is believed, and tradition points that direction, to have been written in the city of Rome, where the early Christian community was at work and where Peter and Paul had been martyred. And uh, Mark was referred to as an interpreter or a secretary for Peter the apostle. So some connection with Peter, and Mark goes back in tradition. If that is true, and I think when you study the text with some care, it does make a lot of historical sense that that was written in that type of environment of early Christian persecution. So we'll be circling back to that in a moment. Now, when you put Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side and follow the outline of their thought, they tell the same basic story. Mark is sort of a very truncated, shortened form. It gives an outline. It's very immediate, very intense. Jesus did this, and then he did this, and then he did this. Matthew and Luke, substantially longer, have large sections of teachings of Jesus that are not included in the Gospel of Mark. And it's interesting, they plug them into the outline that is Mark in different places throughout their Gospels, but they're almost always in the same order. So it's as if Matthew and Luke had both the Gospel of Mark in front of them when they wrote theirs, but also access to a written document that contained teachings of Jesus that they incorporated into each of their respective Gospels. So biblical scholars in the 20th century in the German world are trying to figure out, where did all these teachings come from that are found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark? So they just came up with a name, Quelle, from we get the letter Q, which is just the German word for source. It was a source probably written that these two evangelists had that Mark did not have. The only other explanation you would have is that Mark deleted all the teachings of Jesus from Matthew and Luke to make a shorter gospel, but it would be interesting to sort of try to solve that puzzle. So scholars are trying to figure out, well, these gospels look alike, but which ones are dependent upon which? The scholarly consensus emerged that Mark was first and that Matthew and Luke both used Mark and Q. But in addition to that, there are things found in Matthew's gospel that are not found in Mark or Luke. So special sources that Matthew had, some of them may have been written sources or oral sources. Also, Luke has a significant amount of information in his gospel not found in Mark's gospel and not part of the common teaching found in both Matthew and Luke. So things found only in the Gospel of Luke. For example, the story of the birth of Jesus through Mary's point of view and the shepherds. I'll just throw it real quickly. What might have been a source for this evangelist might have been Mary, right? So, so written sources, oral sources, but distinct from the narrative in Matthew. If you read about the birth of Jesus in Matthew's gospel, it's focused on Joseph and a different perspective. So when you put the two side by side, you begin to notice those things. I haven't mentioned John yet. When you read John's gospel, completely distinct from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A lot of the action happens in Jerusalem rather than Galilee. The way that Jesus speaks in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is like real pungent, powerful, quick stories. parables, sharp ethical statements. In John's gospel, very long monologues where Jesus has an extended, they're almost reflections on the teachings of Jesus, put on the lips of Jesus in a way. So many scholars believe that there's a source that goes back to the historical Jesus, but a different stream of information that goes to what will be the fourth gospel, written, many scholars believe, the last of all, and therefore with the greatest degree of reflectivity and thought, uh, whereas Mark is like very quick. Luke's is the best Greek if you just want to look at a good writer. And even at the beginning of Luke's gospel, Luke tells us that he went back to talk to the original eyewitnesses and to the original ministers of the word to find out what he could to put together an orderly and sequence report of what he had received. So Luke gives us a little insight into what he is about. The thing that makes Luke also very unique is that Luke also gives us the Acts of the Apostles. So we get the early story of the Christian community after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So two-part volume, very, very profound. One of my professors of New Testament was a professor by the name of Father Raymond Collins. I think he's still alive. And his introduction to the New Testament is an introduction to the methods of studying the New Testament. And on pages 126 to 135, he goes into incredible detail. If you're a detail kind of person, about why the solution of Mark is the first of the four to be written with dependency on Mark by Matthew and Luke, why that makes the most sense. And another written source called Q. Now, some Bible scholars say humorously today that we should all take a deep breath and remember Q does not exist anywhere in any book. It's a hypothetical hypothesis to explain the common teachings of Jesus found in Matthew and Luke, but not found in Mark. So I think for that reason, to look at the figure of Jesus, if Mark was the first written, I think it's a great place to start. So that's what we're going to do in a moment. But before I jump into Mark, questions, thoughts, or comments? Yes.
So there are other, I don't want to call them books, but other writings from around that time period that other people refer to as like the Gnostic Gospels. Obviously, we don't. It's not part of the Bible, obviously, but why don't we use them in a sense?
I am so grateful you brought that up because I meant to talk about that. So these so-called other gospels, I love the fact that years ago in Time Magazine or Newsweek or newspapers, usually around Christmas or Easter, you would see a big story in the paper. Church hid secret gospels that tell the real truth about Jesus. And they're referring to these so-called Gnostic gospels of the second century. So one of the things about all of these other gospels, and Meyer will do a fantastic job of distilling the historical background of that, almost all of them have no close historical connection to the Jesus of history. So they're all secondary, very imaginative in character, based on the public proclamation of the gospel that had already come down to the second century. So they're much more imaginative, I would say almost fictional in their approach. The only possible exception is, I think, the Gospel of Thomas, which has some interesting teachings from Jesus that are closely connected to the synoptics and the Gospel of John, but also somewhat distinct. And some contemporary biblical scholars weigh that one a bit differently than all the other Gnostic Gospels. So that's the only one I'll add that has some degree of, is this? But I honestly don't believe it gives us a lot of new information about Jesus, truthfully. So. All right, I want to say a few more things about the Gospel of Mark. Of the four Gospels, the Gospel of Mark presents a portrait of the 12 apostles that is the roughest. I mean, they're kind of, if you read the Gospel, they're often confused. They don't know what's going on. Jesus gets very frustrated with them. Matthew and Luke make the disciples look better. So that's why I think it's likely that Mark was written before Matthew and Luke, because as time goes by, those early apostles become more important in the Christian community. So they want to polish them up a bit, I think. The second thing is when you read about the family of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, the scenes where Jesus encounters his mother and so called brothers and sisters, those encounters are not very, you don't have a lot of warmth about the family of Jesus. Matthew and Luke, especially Luke, much more warm toward the family of Jesus. Again, why would Mark be less respectful of the family of Jesus over time? Whereas you can understand for the other gospel writers, as time goes by, you would have a greater respect. The same is true even about how Jesus is approached in a very human way in the Gospel of Mark. Matthew and Luke increase the reverence of Jesus and his lordship. So over time, you could see that the Christian community would grow in greater respect for the lordship of Christ. You wouldn't think that someone simplifying would make Jesus appear less exalted, right? So there, even theologically, there's a lot of reasons to say that Mark seems to be a bit earlier in its formation. So, all right, the Gospel of Mark. I love the Gospel of Mark because I think Mark is a narrative masterpiece. What Mark does in a very concise narrative is presents what I believe is a very profound theology of Jesus that answers two fundamental questions. The first question is, who is this Jesus of Nazareth? So I think when Mark wrote the gospel, that question was the most important question he's thinking about. Who is this Jesus, and what do I want to say about him to this community? Second question, equally profound, what does it mean to follow him, to be his disciple? I think the Gospel of Mark, when you read it beginning to end, is answering those two fundamental questions. Who is Jesus? What does it mean to follow him? By the way, Mark's Gospel is the shortest of the four. It is easy to sit down and read the whole Gospel in one setting. So that's what I want to encourage you all to do between now and next Tuesday. If you get the chance, sit down, start page 1, read all the way through the end, and see what you discover when you read the gospel. And I encourage you to have that once more astonished approach. Pretend like as you start reading it, like you don't know anything about Jesus and you're trying to find out about him based on what Mark is saying. Read the gospel from that point of view and let yourself be once more astonished, surprised. All right, so I believe that the Gospel of Mark has what I would like to call a hinge. Or, for lack of a better point, a central turning point, a moment in the gospel of incredible importance. And I think that, by the way, the chapters and verses were not, the chapters were added about 1,000 years after the first Greek manuscripts, and verses much later, but I'm so grateful they added them because we can find our way around the text. So if you all have Bibles, I encourage you to open them to chapter 8, verses 27 through 34. My translation is a slightly older translation of the New American Bible before the Revised Version came out, so y'all may have slightly different English wording. How many have the New American Bible? That's the one we read at Mass on Sundays. Okay, quite a few. Anybody have the Revised Standard Version or the New Revised Standard Version? Okay, it's extremely well done translation. Um, what are some of the other more the New International Version, very evangelical tradition, but very good translation. Those are all good English translations. So in chapter 8:27, then Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples this question: Who do people say that I am? They replied, some, John the Baptizer, others, Elijah, still others, one of the prophets. And you, he went on to ask, who do you say that I am? Central question. All right, Caesarea Philippi. In the four Gospels, that's about as far north as Jesus will ever get. Now, there's references to him to being up in Tyre and Sidon, but you don't have any narratives uh, placed in those areas. So Caesarea Philippi is about as far north and as far from Jerusalem as Jesus will get in his public life. And it's dedicated to um, the power of Caesar, thus Caesarea. And so they go to this pagan place, huge cliff. If you go there today, it's a national park. The water comes down off Mount Hermon. The snow up on top is often referenced in the Bible, flows down to the cliffs, and that's the beginning of the Jordan River. That Jordan River will flow all the way down to the Sea of Galilee, which is a freshwater lake, flow out of the Sea of Galilee in the bottom, all the way down through the desert to the Dead Sea. So this is the beginning of the spring. And there was it was considered the gates of hell in those days in a pagan sort of way. And it's interesting that Jesus takes them there to this place. So, Roman imperial power on the one side, gates of hell, and as far from Jerusalem as he's going to get. And halfway through the Gospel of Mark, he is asking a very important question: who are people saying I am? What are the answers? John the Baptizer, John the Baptist, the one who Herod had beheaded. So has he come back to life? That's what people are rumoring. Elijah. Why Elijah, by the way?
Elijah never died.
Okay, yeah. In the Old Testament, there's a few figures that we don't have death records of in weird sorts of way. There's a list in Genesis, so and so lived 100 years, whatever it was, and died. So and so lived this length of time, died. Enoch came to the end of his 108 years, whatever it was, and instead of saying he died, it said he walked with God. So there was this tradition in Judaism that Enoch didn't die, but walked with God. Well, similarly, Elijah at the end of his life was taken up into heaven in a chariot, flaming chariot. So he didn't die on earth. So the thought developed by the first century, the time of Jesus, that Elijah would return from heaven before the arrival of the anointed one, the Messiah of God. So is Jesus the great prophet who is to announce the coming of the Messiah? So, and what was, by the way, the word Messiah? Anybody know what that meant? Or Christ. So Messiah comes from Mashiach, which is Hebrew, and Christos or Christ is the Greek translation. So Christ and Messiah, they both mean someone anointed with oil, olive oil, usually. So who got anointed in the Old Testament? All right, prophets were referred to as anointed, chosen by God for a particular purpose. King David, all the kings of Israel, they didn't crown kings like they did in the medieval period. When someone was chosen by the Lord God to be king, oil was poured over their heads. So the king was anointed, a Messiah, a Christ for the people, chosen by God, anointed by God for a purpose. So prophets, kings, third group that was anointed, were the priest for their service in the temple, had to be anointed with oil. All were chosen by God for some particular purpose. So when in the first century, when people were waiting for a new Messiah, a new Christos, a new Christ, or a new anointed one, They were not thinking primarily in terms of priest or prophet. They still had priests offering sacrifices in the temple. They were waiting for a new king like David, someone to rescue us primarily from the Romans right now, suffering miserably under Roman rule. They're hoping that God will eventually raise up a new David, a son of David, who will again create God's people apart from those Gentiles that have trampled their land for centuries. So the Greeks invaded in 333 BC. The Romans came in about 64 years BC. So they've been under foreign rule for a long time, except for a little Maccabean revolt, right? The window of independence. So they're waiting for a new Messiah, new Christos, as it were. So, with that context, Jesus asked the second question, and you, who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Messiah. You're the Christ. You're the anointed one of God. You're not Elijah or one of the prophets getting ready. You are the one. Now, what does Peter understand by that word? Most likely, he pictures Jesus being a great king like David. He's still referring to things from an earthly framework. And there are clues to that in the text. So let's look at the next little set of verses. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man, he's referring to himself as the Son of Man, had to suffer much, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, be put to death, and rise 3 days later. He said these things quite openly. Peter then took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this, he turned around and, eyeing the disciples, rebuked Peter. Get behind me, you Satan. The word Satan means tempter. You are not judging by God's standards, but by human standards. So, what happened? Jesus is identified by Peter as Christ or Messiah. The anointed one seems to be the right answer, doesn't it? And Jesus begins to talk about the Son of Man is going to suffer and die. And Peter rebukes Jesus, not his window of understanding. So let's look at, and then he will talk about, if a man wishes to come after me, he must deny him very self, take up his cross, and follow in my steps. It's interesting. By the time this gospel was written, they knew that Jesus had been crucified, right? So the word take up your cross now has a meaning. But even before the crucifixion of Jesus, there were people who were crucified and had to carry their crosses. So even then, it would have been ominous. That wouldn't have been a very pleasant imagery for being a follower of Jesus. Let's put it that way. All right, flip over to the next chapter, chapter 9, verse 30. They left that district and began a journey through Galilee, but he did not want anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples in this vein: the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men who will put him to death. 3 days after his death, he will rise. Note the next verse. Though they failed to understand his words, they were afraid to question him. So Jesus has told them one time the Son of Man is going to be crucified. He tells them a second time, more detail. The Son of Man is going to die. They don't understand. They're afraid to question him. Anybody know what happens right after that second prediction, by the way? They returned to Capernaum, and Jesus, inside the house, began to ask, what were you talking about on the way? What were they talking about? Which one of them was the most important, the greatest? Yeah. So after telling them, I'm going to go die, now his closest, most intimate followers are arguing about which one of them is most important. I had a professor who said, we Christians have a remarkable dexterity for missing the point. The original apostles, had also a remarkable dexterity for missing the point, right? Twice he has warned them now. This is not going to be good, folks. All right, let's flip the page to the next chapter. So we'll be in chapter 10, verse 32. The disciples were on the road going up to Jerusalem. Now they're getting close, right? So they started at Caesarea Philippi, far away. Now they're the closest. With Jesus walking in the lead, their mood was one of wonderment. They're kind of amazed. Wow, this big temple in Jerusalem, the big city, we're going up the mountain, you know? While that of those who followed was fear. So the ones outside the inner circle have some fear. They're perhaps more in tune with, oh, this doesn't seem very safe than the core followers of Jesus. Taking the 12 aside, once more he began to tell them what was going to happen to him. We are on our way up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit at him, flog him, and finally kill him. But 3 days later, he will rise. You notice 3 predictions. This is the most detailed of all. I'm getting close. I'm going to give you more information. And do the disciples now go, oh, wow, we get the idea? No. What's the next? All right, James and John approach teacher. We have a request for you. What is it? When you get to your kingdom, can we sit at your right and left hands? We want to be your viceroys in the kingdom, right? So again, they're picturing Jesus is going to be the Messiah, and we want to be in your inner circle of power and leadership in Jerusalem when you take charge. And it's very interesting. Jesus uh, says, do you know what you're asking? Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink, referring to his approaching death? Can you be baptized in the death that I will be baptized in, referring again to his death on the cross? We can, they told him. Jesus said in reply, from the cup that I drink, you will drink, and the bath that I'm immersed in, you will share. And again, he's pointing even beyond to the moment when both of them will face martyrdom and suffering as apostles. Now, what are the other 10 doing? They became indignant about hearing about it. They don't want James and John to have those positions of leadership. They want to be by him. And then Jesus says, you cannot be that way. You know, the Gentiles who have authority lord it over the people around them. They make their importance felt. It cannot be like that with you. And he has to say, anyone who aspires to greatness must serve the rest. Whoever wants to rank first must serve the needs of all. The Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So, 3 profound predictions. I'm going to die. You notice they never seem to pick up on the part about on the 3rd day rise from the dead. And each time Jesus makes this prediction, it's because the apostles around him do not understand. Peter didn't understand what it meant to be Messiah, and the 12 don't understand what it means to follow him or who he really will be. So, how do we know that? Well, let's go back to the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 1, verse 1. I like the way Mark begins crisply. Here begins the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I want to take a moment to highlight identifying Jesus as the Son of God. Do any of your translations in English have little brackets around the Son of God? All right, the reason for that is the ancient text of Mark's gospel. Some of the texts do not include those words, and some of them do. So text biblical scholars say, did it originally include it and then it got omitted by some people? Or was it not included to begin with and someone added it? What makes more sense? Addition makes more sense to me personally. Why would they have added it? Because this is something important that needs to be included in the text. Why would you drop it out? Oops, I forgot to mention he's the Son of God, you know? It seems like adding, but we don't know the answer just based on the actual text itself. But I will tell you the reason it's included in verse 1 is because Jesus, as the Son of God, I believe, is Mark's most important answer to the question, who is this Jesus of Nazareth? And why do I think that? Well, let's look a little ahead to, by the way, when we meet Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, no stories of infancy, nothing about pre-existence like the Gospel of John. You just simply meet Jesus as an adult. And we meet him for the first time actually at his baptism. So in verse 9, during that time, first time we know about Jesus in Mark, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. Immediately on coming up out of the water, he saw the sky rent in two and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. Then a voice came from the heavens, "You are my beloved Son. On you my favor rests." For Mark's gospel, that moment is super significant. Why? It's a revelation from God, a revelation from the Father. And what does the Father say directly to the Son? It's not, by the way, in Mark's gospel, an announcement to the whole crowd. It's the Father speaking directly to Jesus. You are, first person, you are my beloved Son. On you my favor rests. So here at the very baptism of Jesus, we learn Jesus is the Son of God. How do we learn it? From the Father who says it to the Son. That's how we discover it. Let's go back further into Mark's gospel, back to the hinge, Caesarea Philippi, 8:27. Right after the prediction of the first prediction of the passion and carrying the cross, look at chapter 9, verse 2. 6 days later, presumably after Caesarea Philippi, so they've moved from up north down to a mountain that is believed to be in Galilee. So if you go to the Mount of Transfiguration, Tabor, it's a single mountain sticking up off the plain, very dramatic on top. Jesus took Peter, James, and John off by themselves with him and led them up a high mountain. He was transfigured before their eyes, and his clothes became dazzlingly white, whiter than the work of any bleacher could make them. Elijah appeared to them along with Moses. The two were in conversation with Jesus. Then Peter spoke to Jesus, "Rabbi, how good it is for us to be here. Let us erect 3 booths on this side, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He hardly knew what to say, for they were all overcome with awe. A cloud came, overshadowing them, and out of the cloud came a voice, "This is my Son, my beloved. Listen to him." So now we have the Father revealing directly to Peter, James, and John the true identity of who Jesus is. This is my Son, my beloved. Listen to him. What did they need to hear? What he had just said. He's going to go die. All right? So the Father has revealed this twice. Does anybody know, okay, who else knows that Jesus is the Son of God in Mark's gospel as you're going through the gospel? Anybody know who identifies Jesus as the Son of God, the Holy One of God? Not John the Baptist in Mark's gospel. The demons. Yes, the world of the demons know who he is. We know who you are. You're the Holy One of God. Have you come to destroy us, Jesus of Nazareth? So Mark's gospel then is lifted to a cosmic level, right? The human beings around Jesus are experiencing one thing, but Jesus is about the dawning of the kingdom of God, which is a diminishment of the world of darkness that has been holding humanity captive. And the demons know who he is. However, in Mark's gospel, there is no human being that's not possessed by a demon that correctly identifies Jesus as Son of God until one pivotal moment. Anybody know what that moment was?
It's the Roman centurion.
Yes, you got it correctly. Christian got the answer. It's the centurion, and when is it? All right, it's after the death of Jesus. So go to chapter 15 and verse 37. One person described the Gospel of Mark as a passion narrative with an extended introduction. That's sort of what it is. And some people believe that when Mark first wrote it, it might have been written in order to be publicly proclaimed out loud, perhaps at an annual remembrance of the Passion of the Lord, like a Good Friday experience. So you could easily do it in one sitting, as I mentioned. So we're going to proclaim once more the good news of Jesus. So in verse 37, Jesus, uttering a loud cry, breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. What's the sanctuary? It's in the temple, it's the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God, the Shekinah, was believed to dwell. So that sanctuary veil is torn open at the death of Jesus. For me, it's a profound symbolic. This is God the Father's response to the death of his Son, the rending of the curtain. When you found out somebody you loved died when you were a Jew in the first century, you tore your clothes. So God is tearing his clothes at the death of his Son, in a sense. The centurion, who is a Roman soldier who's been part of the crucifixion of Jesus, is standing there, who stood guard over him, on seeing the manner of his death, declared, clearly this man was the Son of God. Not one of the 12, it's a Roman centurion who watched the way that Jesus died and is the first human being in the gospel to correctly identify Jesus as the Son of God. Why do you think Mark waited until this moment in the gospel narrative to have Jesus publicly identified as Son of God? I believe the reason Mark waited until this point is he wants to make it clear that we will never understand Jesus as the Son of God apart from the cross. You have to know that he died for us on the cross to understand what it means for him to be Son of God. So his very identity is as the one given for us on the cross of Calvary. Without that, we don't get Jesus. That's what Mark is saying. Now, a curious thing, you notice, how did the centurion figure it out? He saw Jesus on the cross with his eyes. Let's go back to that hinge in Mark's Gospel, 8:27. We'll go back to that again, of Caesarea Philippi. Look at the story right before Caesarea Philippi. What is the story about? A blind man. When they arrived at Bethsaida, some people brought him, Jesus, a blind man, and begged him to touch him. Jesus took the blind man's hand and led him outside the village. Putting spittle on his eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked, "Can you see anything?" The man opened his eyes and said, "I can see people, but they look like walking trees." Then a second time, Jesus laid his hands on his eyes, and he saw perfectly. His sight was restored, and he could see everything clearly. Jesus sent him home with the admonition, "Do not even go into the village." Now, what do you notice about this blind man? He doesn't come to Jesus asking for help, does he? People bring him to Jesus. Do you notice it's curious that Jesus seems to have trouble healing his blindness? How many gospel stories does Jesus have difficulty healing someone? It's kind of unusual. He doesn't have a name. So this guy can't see. He doesn't come to Jesus on his own. He needs help. Jesus is going through this process, trying to give him the ability to see. And once he can see, he leaves. All right, let's go now to the third prediction of the Passion of Jesus, which was in chapter 10. And that's where James and John want to sit at his right hand and left hand. And right after Jesus reminds them the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for all. Oh, what kind of story do we have? It's the healing of a blind man. Now, notice the difference between the first man that got healed of blindness and the second. They came to Jericho next. Jericho, by the way, is down in the desert, right at the base of the mountain. You're going to climb straight up that mountain to go up to Jerusalem. So Jesus is almost there. And as he was leaving that place with his disciples and a sizable crowd, there was a blind beggar, Bartimaeus. We even have a name, the son of Timaeus, sitting by the roadside. On hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to call out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. He calls for help. Jesus, son of David, King, Messiah, have mercy on me. Many people were scolding him to make him be quiet. Isn't that interesting? Shh, don't ask for help. But he shouted all the louder, Son of David, have pity on me. Then Jesus stopped and said, call him over. Jesus called him. When Jesus calls someone in the Gospels, who are they? They're always apostles or disciples. When Jesus says, come follow me, he means be my follower. So they called the blind man over, telling him as they did so, you have nothing to fear from him. Get up, he's calling you. He threw aside his cloak, jumped up, and came to Jesus. Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? So he asked the important question, what do you want from me? Do you want money? You're a blind beggar. You want food for the day? Rabboni, teacher, the blind man said, I want to see. His request, I want to see. Jesus said in reply, be on your way. Your faith has healed you. Immediately, he received his sight and started to follow Jesus up the road. He became a follower, disciple. He walks with Jesus to Jerusalem. He asks for help to see, and Jesus immediately heals him, and he follows. I believe the blind man, so you have three predictions of the Passion. If you look at the framework, so passion prediction, passion prediction, passion prediction. Each time, misunderstanding, misunderstanding, misunderstanding. Right beforehand, you have this blind man, hard time healing that blind man, doesn't follow Jesus. After all three, you get the narrative of a new follower of Jesus, Bartimaeus. And he gets healing and follows Jesus to Jerusalem. I believe Mark has constructed in a narrative form a story about what it means to be a true disciple and how difficult it is. So, what was the problem with the 12, with Peter and the others? They didn't see, they were blind, spiritually blind. And I think that Jesus is making that point. You all don't see me, you don't get it. Please help us, please help us, please help us. Do you really want to see? I want to see. Then open your eyes. And then it's the opened eyes of the centurion at the cross that see who Jesus is. So if we had to rephrase those two fundamental questions, who is Jesus for the Gospel of Mark? Jesus is the Son of Man, for sure, but he is also Messiah, for sure, the anointed one of God. But most importantly, he is the Son of God who came to give his life for us on the cross. That's what Mark's narrative theology is telling us. And so what needs to happen for a disciple, a follower of Jesus? We have to have our eyes opened. We have to follow Jesus. We have to take up our cross, and we have to be willing to accept the suffering that comes with following Jesus. That's kind of the heart of Mark's gospel. Now, one other curious thing I want to highlight is, let's go to the end of Mark's gospel real quick. chapter 16. Begins on the day of resurrection, first day of the week, verse 1. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought perfumed oils with which they intended to go and anoint Jesus. By the way, why is it these women who are doing this for Jesus? Does anybody know what happened to the 12? Well, what happened when he was arrested in the garden in Mark's gospel? They all left him. Mark says they all left him. So Mark doesn't leave anybody like John at the foot of the cross. In his gospel, Jesus is utterly alone. In fact, the only thing Jesus says, if you reread Mark's Passion, the only thing he says from the cross is, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you forsaken me? Then he dies. There's none of the other comforting things that we get in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or Matthew, Luke, and John. Into your hands I commend my spirit. Father, forgive them. It is finished. All those things. It's simple, sheer human suffering. My God, why have you abandoned? The agony in the garden is very dark. They can't stay awake. So they've abandoned Jesus. What did Jesus tell them at the Last Supper? He told them, you're all going to abandon me. Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. But after I am raised, you will see me in Galilee. That's what he told them at the Last Supper in Mark's Gospel. After I'm raised, you will see me in Galilee. So truthfully, in Mark's recounting of it, the male disciples ran away and left Jesus. But the women followed him, saw his crucifixion. They saw the place where he was buried. And on Easter Sunday, they're going to anoint the body of Jesus. If you go to Jerusalem, by the way, where Calvary is on the tomb of Jesus, there's a little chapel in between the two that marks the place where the women stood watching the death of Jesus. Looking in one direction, you turn the other direction, is the direction of the empty tomb. So very early, just after sunrise on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb and they were saying to one another, who will roll the stone back for us from the entrance to the tomb? When they looked, they found that the stone had been rolled back. It was a huge one. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right, dressed in a white robe. Well, where's the last time in Mark's gospel that there was a man with a white robe? Anybody remember? In the garden when Jesus was arrested. What happened with his white robe? He ran off. He was afraid, and his robe got stripped off of him, so he ran off naked. And now the man is sitting in the white robe again in the tomb of Jesus. Some commentators on Mark think that that's the baptismal garment. That when we abandon Jesus and run off, we leave our baptismal garment behind. But when we're faithful and we stay there for the resurrection, we're wearing our baptismal garment. So it's an interesting imagery. This frightened them thoroughly, but he reassured them. You need not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, the one who was crucified. He has been raised up. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Go now and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him just as he told you. He told them that at the Last Supper. Go tell Peter and the others, and Peter, you'll see him in Galilee. Is there any narrative of the risen Jesus appearing to Peter in Galilee and the others? Yes, John's Gospel, chapter 21. They've gone back to Galilee, they're fishing. So some scholars think that might be the earliest encounter with the risen Christ. They may have, when Jesus was arrested, headed out of town to get away from the Romans and run back to Galilee and gone back to fishing. And the risen one went to them as he had promised at the Last Supper, and he told the women to go, you'll see him in Galilee. They made their way out and fled from the tomb, bewildered and trembling, and because of their great fear, they said nothing to anyone. One translation ends with the words, they left the tomb and said nothing to anyone, for they were much afraid. So the last word in some of the oldest manuscripts is actually the word afraid. Other manuscripts from the Gospel of Mark add what my book says, the longer ending, the shorter ending, the Freer Logian. So there were other endings that found their way added to the text. And again, commentators were asking, well, was Mark's gospel, did it have the endings and somebody took them off and ended with the word afraid? Or did it originally end with the word afraid and for some reason people added more text later? What do you think? What's more likely? Someone would take resurrection appearances off the end or add them on later? Probably add them on. That's my theory and some biblical scholars. And they think that if Mark ended with the words, they fled from the tomb and they said nothing to anyone because they were much afraid, and the Christian community heard the end of the gospel that way, what would have happened inside of them? They wouldn't be just sad, they might identify. So if this gospel was written right after Peter and Paul were martyred and the early Christians first died, and this was first proclaimed to the Christian community, maybe it was written because the early Christian community was now terrified because of what had happened to Peter and Paul. So the gospel was written down for them to hear and say, wow, we've been much afraid. The women who left the tomb that morning are much afraid. But what did the women end up doing? They ended up going and telling the good news. He's risen from the dead. They spread the good news. So, in other words, maybe Mark intentionally left the gospel unfinished so that we, the hearers, would finish it by allowing the grace of God to remove our fear so that we can go out into the world and fearlessly proclaim Jesus is risen from the dead and I am his follower. All right. So, I think that's why I think Mark is a narrative masterpiece. I think the entire narrative, the way it's structured, is teaching us a lot about Jesus and what does it mean to follow him. All right, questions or comments or observations? That's a lot to jump into one whole gospel. And
I know that the gospel's written by, Mark Beckman is inspired by God, because they're inspired. So there have some things that are left off and then added later, or some translations have it or not. Are those still inspired too? How does that all work together?
So we consider the end result, which is the current 27 works of the New Testament, that those are the inspired words of God that God intends for the church to have as canon that shapes the rule of belief for us. So inspired by God, inspired by the Spirit. And there are additional endings added on, but that doesn't mean that from earlier manuscripts that we can't derive incredibly helpful significance in the life of faith. So I think that as a follower of Jesus, to know that it is the moment when he dies for us that we get the greatest clarity about who he really is, for me, that's very profound. And that I want to see that. And I want to follow him. And I want to be bold and to allow my fear to be removed so that I can speak the good news. So, who is Jesus for Mark? Preeminently, most importantly, the Son of God. And what does it mean to follow him? It means that I will not be afraid, but I will take up my cross, follow in his footsteps, and share the good news with others.